Greetings, adventurers. You're listening to The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood with me, Professor Atwood. I'm glad you're here, and I can't wait to tell you about my latest journey. Don't worry, it's a safe space. I'll handle all the danger for you. I designed these stories to help you relax, chill anxiety, and go to sleep. Maybe they'll even put a smile on your face, even if it's a sleepy smile. So please, settle in, relax, and prepare to quietly drift off with me to parts known, unknown, and even some places in between. Comfortable? Very well. Let's get underway. Good evening, adventurers. I hope you're doing well. I also hope you're settled in and at least sitting down, because tonight I'm going to tell you about how things took a turn for me very unexpectedly. As you remember, I had a lovely visit with my children, Patrick and Ellen, and we went sightseeing around LA and even took in some shows at the Magic Castle, courtesy of NASA mission specialist Janet, who, surprisingly, was an erstwhile magician. I then proceeded to give a tour of Site F, the greenhouse, and talked about hydroponics, aeroponics, and emotionally carnivorous plants. My assistant, Bradley, and his girlfriend/mercenary, Dolores, were on vacation in Niagara Falls, so I had the lab to myself. As I was relaxing all alone at home, I received a very unexpected and, dare I say it, threatening communication, which set me off on an adventure I would not soon forget. And I will tell you all about it in a moment. But first, I'd like to mention something about our stories, especially for the new listeners. You Professor Atwood OGs, that's what Bradley calls you, already know the score. Anyway, the stories are designed for you to drift in and out of, and while yes, I do like to tell you a full story every episode, drifting in and out or falling completely asleep is factored into the equation. You can pick things up anywhere, and that's why I do the story recaps at the beginning, and you can go back and listen to previous adventures anytime you wish. So by all means, enjoy the show any way you wish. It's designed that way. No rules and no pressure, adventurers. Now, you may have also noticed that there are new Sleepscape episodes in the high-speed podcast electronic digital feed. These are remixed, remastered, longer, and with all the sounds we record on our journeys, so you can create your own adventure in your mind. We wanted to give you more ways to enjoy the show every month. And as always, don't forget to rate and review the show and maybe post about it, as that's how other adventurers find us. And if you want more info, merchandise like t-shirts and blankets, and donation and Patreon subscription options, you can always go to whitecatentertainment.com. All right, let's get back to the story. The day was starting out to be quite a relaxing one. I made some breakfast and was thinking about having a low-key morning in the Site D library with a cup of tea and a reread of The Hobbit, one of my favorite books, as you know. I love all of the Lord of the Rings books, but The Hobbit holds a special place in my heart as being more light and accessible, which made it perfect for a morning read. The Los Angeles sun shone brightly in through the windows, and I was able to read by natural light as it gently warmed my whole body. I read all about second breakfasts and an unexpected visit from dwarves as I relaxed and read through the morning. You know, I'm thinking about installing a fish tank in the library, or maybe a variable heat gas fireplace. I'm not sure yet. I'll have to give it a little more thought. They'd both make it a more comfortable and relaxing space, so we'll see. If I end up doing both, I just can't put them close together. Anyway, before I knew it, a couple of hours had gone by, but I didn't mind. I was enjoying the day off and checked on a couple of experiments I had running involving three noble gases, Newton's second law of thermodynamics, and the color orange. Everything was going smoothly. I decided to make myself some lunch and made a grilled cheese with tomato sandwich and used fresh tomatoes from my hydroponics lab, so they were delicious. I brought my lunch and ate it out in the garden. Even the gardener, Peter, was off today, so the lab and even the gardens were all very quiet, save for a couple of birds and a gentle breeze. I mean, quiet for Los Angeles anyway. There's always a helicopter somewhere, but even the Los Angeles skies seemed quiet and peaceful today. I went back inside and then went to my living room and watched a documentary on dinosaurs that only got 3 things wrong, so I was impressed. I just started another one on asteroids and comets, which was so relaxing that I fell asleep for an unscheduled afternoon nap. I was awoken from my afternoon nap by a tapping at my chamber door. I mean, I'm kidding. I just love Edgar Allan Poe and his poem, The Raven, and that's certainly what it reminded me of. I mean, there was a knock at my door, which was unusual, as the mailman and delivery people know where to leave lab deliveries, and I wasn't expecting any company. Who would be knocking? I wondered if that's what had inspired Edgar Allan Poe all those years ago, a mysterious visitor. Now, you see, The Raven is a narrative poem by Edgar Allan Poe, first published in January 1845, though poem is often noted for his musicality, stylized language, and supernatural atmosphere. It tells of a distraught lover who is paid a mysterious visit by a talking raven. The lover, often identified as a student, is lamenting the loss of his love, Lenore. Sitting on a bust of Pallas, the raven seems to further antagonize the protagonist with its constant repetition of the word nevermore. The poem makes use of folk, mythological, religious, and classical references. Poe claimed to have written the poem logically and methodically, with the intention to create a poem that would appeal to both critical and popular tastes, as he explained in his 1846 follow-up essay, The Philosophy of Composition. The poem was inspired, in part, by a talking raven in the novel Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Poe based the complex rhythm and meter on Elizabeth Barrett's poem, Lady Geraldine's Courtship, and made use of internal rhyme as well as alliteration throughout. The Raven was first attributed to Poe in print in the New York Evening Mirror on January 29, 1845. Its publication made Poe quite popular in his lifetime, although it did not bring him much financial success. Well, I don't think that surprised anyone, including in 1845, that no one was going to get rich from a poem. The poem was soon reprinted, parodied, and illustrated. Critical opinion is divided as to the poem's literary status, but it nevertheless remains one of the most famous poems ever written. I've always found it to be many things, from melancholy to off-putting, as with all poetry, of course. Now, I'll read you a quick snippet of it. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more." Now, Poe wrote the poem as a narrative, without intentional allegory or didacticism. The main theme of the poem is one of undying devotion. The narrator experiences a conflict between desire to forget and desire to remember. He seems to get some pleasure from focusing on loss. The narrator assumes that the word nevermore is the raven's only stock in store, and yet he continues to ask it questions, knowing what the answer will be. His questions, then, are purposely self-deprecating and further incite his feeling of loss. Poe leaves it unclear whether the raven actually knows what it is saying, or whether it really intends to cause a reaction in the poem's narrator. The raven perches on a bust of Pallas Athena, a symbol of wisdom meant to imply the narrator is a scholar. Poe said that the narrator actually is a young scholar. Though this is not explicitly stated in the poem, it is mentioned in The Philosophy of Composition. It is also suggested by the narrator reading books of lore, as well as by the bust of Pallas Athena, Greek goddess of wisdom. I mean, who other than a pretentious scholar would do that? And honestly, when I found out the subject of Poe's poem was a scholar, I started to identify more with the raven. Poe chose a raven as the central symbol in the story because he wanted a non-reasoning creature capable of speech. After considering a politician, he decided on a raven, which he considered equally capable of speech because it matched the intended tone of the poem. Poe said the raven is meant to symbolize mournful and never-ending remembrance. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Poe was also inspired by Grip, the Raven in Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. One scene in particular bears a resemblance to the raven. At the end of the 5th chapter of Dickens' novel, Grip makes a noise and someone says, "What was that? Him tapping at the door?" The response is, "'Tis someone knocking softly at the shutter." Dickens' raven could speak many words and had many comic turns, including the popping of a champagne cork, but Poe emphasized the bird's more dramatic qualities. Poe had written a review of Barnaby Rudge for Graham's magazine saying, among other things, that the raven should have served a more symbolic, prophetic purpose. The similarity did not go unnoticed. James Russell Lowell, in his A Fable for Critics, wrote the verse, "Here comes Poe with his raven, like Barnaby Rudge, 3/5 of him genius and 2/5 sheer fudge." I suppose you could say that was the 19th century equivalent of trolling, as Bradley calls it. The Free Library of Philadelphia has on display a taxidermied raven that is reputed to be the very one that Dickens owned that helped inspire Poe's poem. It is also rumored to be cursed, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, my own rapping and tapping at my own chamber door had not ceased, and it was time to see who it was. I walked to the door as the rapping and tapping became louder. To my astonishment, when I opened the door, it was an actual raven, rapping, tapping, tap, tap, tapping at my chamber door. Now, this clearly made me a little uncomfortable, as you can imagine. While I was a fan of Poe's poem, I can't say an imposing large black raven is my favorite bird. But that being said, this one was a little extra off-putting. This raven had a scar in his face, and it seemed to get larger the longer I looked at it, already going past his occasionally squawking beak. I mean, have you ever seen a raven up close and staring you down, especially one with a scar of variable length? It can be a bit startling, to say the least. Now, the common raven, or Corvus corax, is a large all-black passerine bird. It is the most widely distributed of all corvids, found across the northern hemisphere. It is a raven known by many names at the subspecies level. I mean, there's at least 8 subspecies with little variation in appearance, although recent research has demonstrated significant genetic differences among populations from various regions. It is one of the 2 largest corvids, along with the thick-billed raven, and is possibly the heaviest passerine bird. At maturity, the common raven averages 25 inches in length and 3.2 pounds in weight. Although their typical lifespan is considerably shorter, common ravens can live more than 23 years in the wild. Young birds may travel in flocks but later mate for life, with each mated pair defending a territory. Common ravens have coexisted with humans for thousands of years, and in some areas have been so numerous that people have regarded them as pests. I can certainly see why, especially if they're rap-tap-tapping at your door. Part of their success as a species is due to their omnivorous diet. They are extremely versatile and opportunistic in finding sources of nutrition, feeding on carrion, insects, cereal grains, berries, fruit, small animals, and food waste. Some notable feats of problem-solving provide evidence that the common raven is unusually intelligent. Over the centuries, the raven has been the subject of mythology, folklore, art, and literature. In many cultures, including the indigenous cultures of Scandinavia, ancient Ireland and Wales, the northwest coast of North America, and Siberia, and Northeast Asia, the common raven has been revered as a spiritual figure or godlike creature, which I'm sure has gone to this raven's head as he arrogantly stared back at me. I immediately thought, why was he here and who had sent him? I was about to learn the answer. The arrogant and imposing large black raven was holding a letter in his beak, and it had a wax seal on it. I recognized the seal, and that made me even a little more uncomfortable. It was an atom with a triangular graduated cylinder on top with a line through it. The original thought was that it was supposed to mean no science restrictions, but they didn't pay enough to the graphic designer who couldn't fit restrictions on the logo, so it just says no science on it, which of course has a completely different meaning. I mean, you get what you pay for, even when designing evil logos. I suppose they never got around to having it redone. It looks like I was having a message delivered via Raven from the Infinite Science Cabal, or ISC. So, who does this incomplete evil logo actually represent? Well, the truth is, there's a group of scientists out there that don't always have the best of intentions in mind. They were all kicked out of the Munich Science Conference for presentations and experiments that didn't really align with science conference values, and they have never forgotten the slight. These scientists dabble in weather machines, gene splicing, the algorithm for credit card interest rates, pocket tsunami generators, political commentary, social media, autonomous space lasers, and genetically altered foods. So they are into everything nefarious, unfortunately. They tried to recruit me a while back, and as you can imagine, I sent them packing, along with putting the USP, the Universal Science Police, on their trail. They weren't happy about it, and like all evil geniuses, they hold grudges. But the worst was their leader, Professor Papadoodle. I know, it's hard not to smile when you hear or say his name, and he's quite aware of that, and I think that's also part of why he's angry all the time. Now, Professor Papadoodle, okay, I'm sorry, I think I may just have to call him Professor P from now on. He had always had grand ambitions and didn't care about science ethics and was always willing to sell his services to the highest bidder. Now, if I was receiving a calling bird, I knew there was trouble afoot, and it would not be pleasant. I cautiously took the envelope from the raven's beak. It squawked, annoyed, and gave me one last stare as the scar on its face grew longer yet again. It then literally turned tail and flew off in a raven's version of a huff, its mission complete. I opened the letter, and honestly, it was even worse than I expected. It wasn't a friendly recruitment letter at all this time. It was more of a challenge with a hint of a threat. It started off with Professor P telling me how he's been watching me this whole time, through his agents, both human and animal, on the Orient Express on the way to the science conference in Munich, down in the Amazon on Captain Flynn's boat, and even on Benny's secret island when he sent a seal to ruin Benny's wedding, but I had intervened and helped to save it. The variable length scar on his agents had a side effect of the brain implants, which did everything from facilitate silent communication to allow a full body override. Benny's vacation island was quite well hidden, and I had only found it by accident that one time my submarine was caught in a storm, But it turns out Professor P knew all about it and was at one time a client of real estate agent Alice's, but Benny outbid him for the secret island, and he never forgot that slight either. I mean, technically, I don't even know if I would call that a slight. I mean, Professor P just wasn't as rich being a science villain as Benny was being a studio washboard player. That certainly wasn't Benny's fault. It was most certainly disconcerting knowing I was being watched this whole time. Now, I'll admit I knew there was something off with people and animals with scars of varying length, but I never put it together as directed malfeasance by a disgraced evil scientist and his organization. But that still didn't explain why he was contacting me now. I mean, the letter went on and on about perceived slights, accomplishments propped up by delusions of grandeur, and other such nonsense. But there it was, at the end of the letter. It was a challenge. And it said, "I know where Professor Sampson is. Come find me, and if you defeat me, I will tell you where he is. Come alone. No lab assistance." And there it was. Professor Sampson was a brilliant scientist and explorer, but more importantly, he was my mentor. He taught me everything about science and adventuring, and tried to teach me how to have patience with scholars, and I'll admit that part didn't really take. But Professor Sampson had disappeared under mysterious circumstances years ago and was never seen again. I searched for him the world over and could never find a trace. So I wasn't sure if Professor P was lying or he really did know where he was. Either way, I had to find out. It was most likely a trap, but it didn't matter. I had to know either way, and if Professor P did know something about Professor Sampson's whereabouts, it was worth the risk. Professor P left directions to his lair, which was in an active volcano. Now, I doubt it was really an actual active volcano, as that makes evil lair logistics problematic, in addition to poor air quality. It was most likely a dormant volcano that he used special effects to make appear active. That's the thing about Professor P. Not only was he evil, he was also incredibly cheap. Regardless, it wasn't close by. I would once again have to traverse the Pacific Ocean. I would need to use the submarine, and it was too difficult to put a crew for the recovery together on such short notice. Plus, I needed more speed and automation, which the submarine provided. Now, it would be a bit more difficult without Bradley, but this was something I needed to do on my own. Now, had I called Bradley, he and Dolores would have made their way back here in a flash, and that's exactly why I didn't call them. I wanted them to enjoy their vacation, and to be honest, in addition to the condition of coming alone, there was another reason. Professor Sampson was my mentor, and Professor P was my villain. There's some things you just need to do on your own, and this was one of them. Also, I don't believe I ever told you the name of my submarine. I'll admit we usually just refer to it as the Submarine, but I did christen her just before her maiden voyage as the O2. Yes, I named the submarine after oxygen, as that's not only what powers it with my patented oxygen engine, it's also what sustains it. I've always been fascinated with submarines, and always found the history quite interesting. The history of the submarine goes back to antiquity. Humanity has employed a variety of methods to travel underwater for exploration, recreation, research, and significantly, warfare. While early attempts such as those by Alexander the Great were rudimentary, the advent of new propulsion systems, fuels, and sonar propelled an increase in submarine technology. The introduction of the diesel engine, then the nuclear submarine, saw a great expansion in submarine use, and specifically military use, during World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. The Second World War use of the U-boat by the Germans against the Royal Navy and commercial shipping, and the Cold War's use of submarines by the United States and Russia, helped solidify the submarine's place in warfare and popular culture. The latter conflicts also saw an increasing role for the military submarine as a tool of subterfuge, hidden warfare, and nuclear deterrent. The military use of submarines continues to this day, obviously, predominantly by North Korea, China, the United States, and Russia. Beyond their use in warfare, submarines continue to have recreational and scientific uses. I'm not so sure about recreational, but they are heavily employed in the exploration of the seabed and the deepest places of the ocean floor. They are used extensively in search and rescue operations for other submarines, surface vessels, and aircraft, and offer a means to descend vast depths without the reach of scuba diving for exploration. They remain a focus of popular culture and the subject of numerous books and films. Probably the most famous would be Das Boot and The Hunt for Red October, if you really want to have an evening of submarine movies. The first American military submarine was Turtle in 1776, a hand-powered egg-shaped, or acorn-shaped, depending on which angle you were viewing from, device designed by David Bushnell to accommodate a single man. It was the first submarine capable of independent underwater operation and movement. However, according to British naval historian Richard Compton Hall, the problems of achieving neutral buoyancy would have rendered the vertical propeller of the Turtle useless. The operator, Ezra Lee, was an American colonial soldier best known for commanding and operating the one-man Turtle submarine. Compton Hall suggested that the route that the Turtle had to take to attack its intended target, the HMS Eagle, was slightly across the tidal stream and which would, in all probability, have resulted in the operator becoming completely exhausted. There are also no British records of an attack by a submarine during the war. In the face of these and other problems, Compton Hall suggests that the entire story around the Turtle was fabricated as disinformation and morale-boosting propaganda, and that if Ezra Lee did carry out an attack, it was in a covered rowing boat rather than in Turtle. Now, this is obviously in dispute, as it is possible that during the attack the tide turned and Lee was unable to compensate. He released a keg of gunpowder when British sailors in rowboats attempted to pursue him. The British, suspecting some trick, gave up their pursuit. Replicas of Turtle have been built to test the design. One replica, Acorn, constructed by Duke Riley and Jesse Bushnell, claiming to be a descendant of David Bushnell, used the tide to get within 200 feet of the RMS Queen Mary II in New York City. A police boat then stopped Acorn for violating a security zone. Now, the turn of the 20th century marked a pivotal time in the development of submarines, with a number of important technologies making their debut, as well as the widespread adoption and fielding of submarines by a number of nations. Diesel-electric propulsion would become the dominant power system, and instruments such as the periscope would become standardized. Batteries were used for running underwater, and gasoline or diesel engines were used on the surface and to recharge the batteries. Early boats used gasoline, but quickly gave way to kerosene, then diesel, because of reduced flammability. Effective tactics and weaponry were refined in the early part of the century, and the submarine would have a large impact on 20th century warfare. Now, while the O2 didn't have any weapons on it per se, there were a lot of useful tools, scientific equipment, and a boat pod subsystem that I used to bypass Benny's holographic defenses on his secret vacation island. Somehow, I think it would be much harder this time. Professor P knew I was on my way, as he knew I couldn't resist the challenge. I had a lot of preparation to do ahead of me, and then I had an evil scientist to confront and a mentor to save. It would be a busy week, for sure, and I will tell you all about my journey to confront Professor P next time. But before I end this evening's story, I want to talk to you about something. While it's always best to try and de-escalate or avoid conflict, sometimes it's unavoidable, and that's when it can get uncomfortable, and we always have the urge to avoid it completely if we can. But that serves no purpose. as conflict will find us eventually, no matter where we go or what we do. Best to meet it head on if it's unavoidable. Yes, it takes courage and determination, and the outcome isn't always certain. But that's what being an adventurer is all about, and I know you have it in you. So understand that you can't avoid conflict completely and confidently step into that ring. And take comfort in the fact that win or lose, you'll always be stronger on the other side of it. Now, hopefully you won't be dealing with too many cheapskate evil scientists in your life, but you never know. Good hunting, adventurers.
The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood was created, written, and performed by Chris Mancini and produced by White Cat Entertainment. It is a work of fiction. Maybe. Music and sound design by Ron Tansky at rontanskymusic.com. For more info and merchandise, including t-shirts, mugs, and blankets, go to whitecatentertainment.com.